These images are part of the rich history of Southwest Saskatchewan, telling the story of everyday life through a Métis perspective. The Métis trace their ancestry to the First Nations and European settlers, where First Nations women in Canada and the U.S. married fur traders from Scotland, France, and England. Through these mixed marriages, their children became the Métis we know today. In Southwest Saskatchewan, one of their settlements was Lake Palshei, 30 minutes south of Swift Current.
The Lake Palshei Métis settlement was only around from the late 1800s till about the mid-1920s. I was told that my great-grandparents wanted to move back to Montana because they heard they weren't going to be recognized as Indians in Canada, and I think they were concerned about maybe losing rights or maybe not being able to cross the border or that kind of thing. So they moved back to Harlem, Montana. My grandmother Tilly and her sister Annie stayed in Saskatchewan. They both married men from up here and stayed here, but the rest of the family moved to the States.
As part of an exhibition entitled Turning the Lens, these images are part of an Indigenous Archive project created by Seesequasis.
It began 5 years ago now. My mother is a residential school survivor, and she was a witness to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was after one of the hearings in Saskatoon, she just made a comment to me that we were hearing a lot about all the horrible things about residential schools and what had happened in the past, but she also commented about the strength of Indigenous families and how they kept language and culture alive and how people worked hard during hard times. So that got me thinking about, okay, what evidence is there of that in terms of photography? So I began to research through archives, museums, historical societies, and tried to find photos that sort of reframed Indigenous experience, avoiding the negativity or framing it as something tragic, but rather the positive aspects of Indigenous life through the 1900s. I began to post these online, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Mostly on Facebook because that's where most of the community is. And people began to identify the photos, name them, say that's my auntie, that's my uncle. And then stories began to unfold from that. And eventually we got to where it is today with thousands of followers, a book that's just come out with Knopf Canada, and this traveling exhibition, which changes depending on where it is. And then with Barb Parchman, who obviously works here at the gallery and is a Métis archivist, working with her, we're able to access photos from the Lac Peltier Métis settlement. Most of those photos go back a bit further, from the 20s and 30s, but they also have narratives of the families and where they, after the dispersal of the Métis settlement, where people went, whether it was Montana or different parts of the province, Val-Marie, wherever. So it seemed a nice blend to have both the Lac Peltier and the Niqaniq photos from Maple Creek in this exhibit.
The work on display celebrates the everyday, as well as the ongoing resilience in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities from the 1920s through to the 1980s. along with local images from Maple Creek and Lake Palshei. There is also a selection of national photos taken by Rosemary Eaton.
She was an English woman actually who came to Canada in the mid-1950s and began to travel the country. She was kind of a pioneering woman photojournalist. She traveled through Saskatchewan, BC, Alberta, and through what is now Nunavut. So she took photos from the far north as well. For whatever reason, she took an interest in Indigenous communities, whether it's First Nation or Inuit, wherever she traveled. And she took photos in the communities of people just going about work or women with their babies. She had an ability to disarm people and make them feel at ease. So I think that's very much portrayed in her portfolio of photos, and it kind of went against the grain of what people were expecting from seeing photos of Indigenous life. So I don't think she wasn't that successful during her working journalism life selling those photos, because the mainstream media wasn't interested in that kind of image. They wanted residential schools or tragic things, and she was framing positive things.
And my parents would come there, and her parents would get on a boat, and they'd go to Darling's Beach to dance, or at the North End. And we could hear the music across the water, and it sounded so good. And that was the family. We were with that family lots.
Having grown up at Lake Palshei, Cecile Blank is a Métis elder who knows firsthand the lifestyle depicted in these pictures.
We appreciated the lake, the territory, the trees, all the natural things. That was part of us. We really, really appreciated where we lived, how we lived, and who we were with. Even the white people came in, and we were with them too. We learned about them, but they learned about us too. And so that's why when you see these pictures, look at, they had a garden. We hunted, we trapped, we fished, and we cut poles to make fences. And that was sold to the newcomers because they needed a fence to keep their horses in. That's what they had to farm with. So we were a help to the people that arrived. We taught them how to survive in this wide open prairie. So the Métis were very, very important to the newcomers that came.
So this is Billy Gunn and Sam Lemire, and the Lemire's lived at the Lemire's Point, it was called, at Lake Palshei. They netted whitefish for a living, and then they sold it to people in Swift Current and the whole area around Lake Palshei until I think it was the early 60s when the government wouldn't allow them to net the whitefish anymore. There was 10 children, I think, in the Lemire family. Alec Lemire was the last one to live at the lake, and when he left, he sold his land so that Lake Palshei Regional Park could be formed. Billy Gunn was an interesting man. He lived at Duncairn Dam on the south end of the dam close to Simi. He was a scout for the Northwest Mounted Police. He was in the First World War, so he was a war veteran. He worked on ranches in the area. There's a Gunn PFRA pasture south of Shaunavon, and that would have been originally some of the Gunn family land.
In these photos, we're introduced to the people of the Niconeat First Nation. As the only First Nations reserve in southwest Saskatchewan, these images were taken in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and were part of a research project by archaeologist John W. Bennett.
John Bennett was an archaeologist who came up to the Maple Creek area for about 3 decades, doing research during the summer seasons, researching ranching community, Hutterite community, as well as Indigenous community. So when he wrapped up his work, he was looking for an archives for his research to go to, including his photographs, chose working with Donnie White to deposit them in Medicine Hat. The photographs collection is approximately 3,500 images, and they're photographs that he took as part of his work. He would attend many events, observe community, and take his camera with him. There are a lot of photos, for example, around community events in Maple Creek, or a lot of ranching, a lot of rodeo. So he would photograph people and places and events and often capture life as it was happening.
Along with identifying individuals, like the young girl in this photo, this exhibition continues to raise awareness that Indigenous life here in Southwest Saskatchewan should be celebrated.
A lot of times, the history of First Nations and Métis haven't been at the forefront of our community history narrative. And sitting here earlier, listening to the different presenters talk, I thought, how nice that finally we're at a point where the history of all of our residents here in the Southwest are finally being told and celebrated in a similar way. I think this exhibition is great, insofar as that it's not just First Nations from Southwest Saskatchewan, but also the Métis. And of course, we have such a rich Métis history here in the Cypress Hills area, in Swift Current and in Val-Marie. And I think that's a story that up until now hasn't really been told particularly well. And I think part of it was the stigma associated with being Métis. I know my own grandfather wasn't comfortable discussing that aspect of his heritage until much later in life.
So I think it's really important to keep talking about the history in this area so that we can acknowledge it as our own, so that the First Nations and Métis people who were here can be proud of their history, because for so long they've been ridiculed about being here and not acknowledged for their contribution.